So let me begin by welcoming back a good friend of La Asok, Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, who I got to meet in person for the first time earlier this summer when she came here to Toronto to participate in a Jewish mindfulness meditation retreat that we were both part of. Rabbi Tuchman is a sought-after speaker, a spiritual leader, and educator. She was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018. She's based in the Washington, D.C. area. She teaches, consults with, and provides workshops and trainings to individuals and organizations across North America on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access and inclusion. She brings a deep commitment to radical inclusivity and a belief in the ability of anyone to take hold of Torah and contribute their unique insights to all of her teaching. That's what she brings to her teaching. So let me invite you all to join with me in the blessing for study. I'm going to share my screen here and if you'd like, you unmute now so we can join together in this blessing. And then we're going to turn things over after a brief introduction to Rabbi Tuchman. Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech
Eloheinu melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
asher
kishanu
tzidkenu
b'mitzvotav,
Tzivanu
la'asok
Torah.
which means in Hebrew, blessed is the eternal source of the universe, whose mitzvot, whose commandments make us holy, and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. We're here today to talk about Shemini Atzeret, and I'll let Rabbi Tuchman really do the talking about what Shemini Atzeret is, but I think it's important to acknowledge before we begin our discussion that Shemini Atzeret has taken on an additional meaning over the course of the last 2 years, which is that Shemini Atzeret on the Jewish calendar is now also the anniversary of the terrible October 7th attacks that occurred on Shemini Atzeret. Depending on how you observe the calendar, it may have also been Simchat Torah, but it was certainly Shemini Atzeret as well. And so today, as we sit in this liminal place where we're hopeful that a peace deal is in the works, of ceasefire deal is in the works of some kind, it's appropriate that we return to Shemini Atzeret, which is in and of itself a beautiful practice. We're not really going to talk about that aspect of this day today during our session, but it is absolutely back of mind and maybe even front of mind for a lot of us. So I want to acknowledge that as we turn to this discussion about an ancient holiday, or as Rabbi Tuchman put it in her title, the most important Jewish holiday you've never heard of. So with that, I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. And I want to begin by saying Moedim L'Simcha to everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful Sukkot Chag Sameach. And I'm really delighted to be able to offer this teaching today on Shmini Atzeret, which is my favorite of the fall holidays, which might sound really strange. And I'll say a little bit more about why that is. Because Shmini Atzeret, in lots of contexts, has sort of taken a back seat to Simchat Torah, which is actually a later rabbinic innovation, which we'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. But we're going to be spending today's time really thinking about Shmini Atzeret in its own right, both liturgically and in terms of what the day can bring into our lives contemporaneously. So I am someone who, as Rabbi Surfer named, I am based in the Washington, D.C. area, and I have been in Jewish communities in the diaspora that keep 2 days of biblical festivals, and that includes Shmini Atzeret. And so what that means for my observance is that the second day is Simchat Torah, and the first day is Shmini Atzeret. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, as well as in many diaspora communities, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are observed together on one day. So we'll be thinking today and really talking today about Shmini Atzeret in terms of its observance and its placement. And it's kind of an interesting bridge because it is not part of Sukkot officially. But in some ways, there are parts of Sukkot that carry over to Shmini Atzeret. And the rabbis, both in terms of the Torah, the sources there, and also later rabbinic sources in the Talmud and beyond, kind of have a little bit of a complicated question. Is this day part of Sukkot? Is it? It's a holiday in its own right. We'll see a source later from the Talmud that says that it's a regal lifnei atzmo, meaning a holiday in its own right. And there are also ways in which, as I said, pieces of Sukkot kind of carry over, and it's sort of like a closing day of the festival. So, bearing that dual complicated identity in mind, I want to actually begin with what Shemini Atzeret actually means. Shmini meaning eight or the eighth, and Atzeret often gets translated as the eighth day of assembly. It comes from the Hebrew root atzer, which means to stop, to pause. And Rashi, who's a preeminent medieval biblical commentator, talks about Shmini Atzeret as kind of like the day when we pause and we linger with God. There's this spiritual idea, and this is something that I really love about the day, that you have this additional day after the joyousness of Sukkot, after having come through Rosh Hashanah and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of Tshuva, and then Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot. After all of that marathon of holidays, which I don't know about any of you, but I definitely feel like Tishrei is a marathon, after you've gotten through all of that, then you have this day that's really just about lingering in the joy of the holiday before returning back to our regular lives the rest of the year. Later on, and we'll see a little bit of this in the Talmud directly, but later on, Simchat Torah, the joy of Torah, became the name for the second day of the observance of Shmini Atzeret in those communities that kept 2 days. So, as a reminder, in Bavel, which we think of as now Iraq, this was one of the biggest and most established Jewish communities. They kept 2 days of all of the pilgrimage festivals. So, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot, and of course, Shmini Atzeret. All of those were 2 days instead of one. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, pilgrimage festivals were kept for one day. So whatever it said in the Torah, you keep a full day of Chag on the first day of Sukkot, for example, and that's it. Whereas in Bavel, it became the first day and the second day of Sukkot, and that practice has continued in some diaspora communities. And so, because the Torah says the eighth day is this solemn day of assembly, that then becomes the eighth day and then the day following it. So there was a question, well, what are we supposed to do with this ninth day, right? It often happens at Pesach as well, where there's often a question around like, okay, so technically, according to the Torah, you have 7 days of Pesach. So then you've got this eighth day in lots of diaspora communities, not all, of course, but many. So what do you do with that? And in terms of Pesach, it just sort of became its own, additional day. And some people have some interesting customs around different kinds of meals. That's particularly true in the Hasidic community, but in my own experience, it's just kind of like, here's another day of no chametz. But in contrast to that, Shmini Atzeret, the second day of that, became Simchat Torah, which then got related to the holiday cycle. I mean, excuse me, the yearly annual Torah reading cycle and the joy of finishing one cycle and beginning another. So I want to invite us now. We have a source sheet. I'm going to invite us to share our screen, and we're going to start with the Torah. Take a few minutes to look at some of the texts in the Torah, and I'm also going to mention one Torah source that is not here because it actually doesn't mention Shmini Atzeret, which is very interesting. Can I please have a reader to read the first source, which is from Vayikra, the book of Leviticus 23, verses 36 and 39 specifically?
Yes, I'm gonna call on Amy, please, to read this first source, if you don't mind, Amy.
Mhm. And apologies, the verses are a little disjointed, but I brought in just the verses that specifically mention Shmini Atzeret.
Very fair. 7 days you shall bring offerings by fire to Hashem. On the eighth day you shall observe a sacred occasion and bring an offering by fire to Hashem. It's a solemn gathering. you shall not work at your occupations. Mark on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the field of your land, you will observe festival of Hashem to last 7 days total. Complete rest on the first day, and a complete rest on the 8th.
Thank you, Amy, so much for that really beautiful reading. I
You're
want to just
welcome.
make a Yeah, thank you so much. I want to just make a couple comments about this, and then I want to, if anyone wants to drop any comments to the chat, about this. So the Torah here is pretty sparse, pretty sparse, excuse me, about this particular day, right? We're told that the eighth day is a solemn occasion, and um, no malacha is to be done, no active work. We're not supposed to, gets translated as none of the work that you do in your occupation. So it's a full day of rest. Don't go to work, don't do malacha, don't do prohibited labor. And then we are told, and we'll see this a little bit more in the next source about the offerings that are brought. And the reason that I brought this here is because, of course, as liberal Jews, I imagine none of us are really excited about the idea of for bringing animal sacrifices again. And the Torah, talks a lot about that. That's partially because, of course, that's how our ancestors connected to Hashem in a very visceral way. They brought the best that they had, and they made these different korbanot. And as we'll see, that the eighth day, and we get this even more in Numbers, the eighth day has a much more pared down, for lack of a better word, offering. It doesn't necessarily appear that way when we first read it, but Sukkot is seen as this universal holiday, right? Where you have 70 offerings, ultimately, of bulls every day. Like there's one less, but ultimately there's 70 offered. It's seen as this chag for the nations, right? It's our holiday in lots of ways. And at the same time, it's this time of ingathering and universality, whereas Shemini Atzeret is seen as much more of a narrowly focused holiday on the connection between the Jewish people and God, whereas Sukkot is this joyous time that we are focusing on the connection between all of us, all nations of the world, and God. So that's one way of understanding Shemini Atzeret, and there's a little bit of piece of that in this Torah text, although it's, as I named, it's pretty sparse. So can I have an additional reader for the Numbers text?
Yes, we're going to turn to the Numbers passage, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Is it Sydney?
Yes, you got it. Thank you, Sydney. So source 2?
Yes, please.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
All right. So on the 8th day, you shall hold a solemn gathering. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall present a burnt offering, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to Hashem, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs without blemish. The meal offerings and libations for the bull, the ram, and the lambs, the quantities prescribed. And 1 goat for a sin offering, in addition to the regular burnt offering, its meal offering and libation.
Thank you, Sydney, so much for that beautiful reading. The thing I want to just point out here is that we are, according to this text in Numbers, the offering on this eighth day, this Shemini Atzeret, is 1 bull and 1 ram and 7 yearling lambs, in addition to all the other things that were just named. So that is in contrast, as I said, to everything that came before it on Sukkot. So there's this way that Shmini Atzeret is much more intimate in certain ways than the remainder of Sukkot. And there isn't, as we said, a ton to go on here beyond, great, you're going to have this eighth day, you're going to offer these things, you're going to not work. Okay, great. So what do we do with this, right? And over time, Shmini Atzeret, and we can pause screen share for now. Thank you so much. Um, Shmini Atzeret has taken on in lots of communities different liturgical features, I guess you could say. So One of the most important, and I did not bring any examples of this today because we could have gone into a whole entire discussion just on Geshem, just on the prayer for rain. And I decided that I wanted a broader approach to the Chag and a less emphasis on the content of the prayer for rain. But it's really important to mention Geshem. So Geshem is the Hebrew word for rain, and I imagine this happens at different places liturgically based on your community. In those communities which do what's known as Musaf, or the additional service is meant to replicate the additional offering made on holidays in the temple, and it became known as Musaf, or additional. In some communities, the prayer for rain is part of the Amidah of that service. And it's an opportunity, it's like really the high point of the entire holiday season for people to focus on the need for rain, specifically in the land of Israel. Those of us in the diaspora, of course, have different climate, patterns, and of course, climate change is impacting us all. But if we think about our ancient rabbinic ancestors and forebears, this was really the time when the rainy season was going to begin. And the rainy season was critically important because if you didn't have sufficient rain, you would not have sufficient crop and you would not be able to have a good year. And a lot of argument has been made that Shemini Atzeret is really building on all of these prayers that we brought from Rosh Hashanah into Yom Kippur, into Sukkot. Part of why we wave the lulav and etrog this week has to do with that agricultural aspect of Sukkot. There are all those beautiful interpretations of the four species having to do with all the different kinds of people in the Jewish community, bringing everybody together, a certain way of making perhaps we could even argue, I would say, that the four species is a bit of a fertility rite. But if you think about when you shake the lulav, it sort of sounds a little bit like rain falling, which is an observation that I made. I noticed a couple of years ago. I was like, oh, this really does sound kind of like rain. It's almost like this deep hope for rain. And that then gets amplified when the prayer is actually offered. And in the prayer for rain, we invoke our ancestors. Many of us in egalitarian communities use what's known as egalitarian Geshem, which means that we say a prayer for rain that brings in all kinds of um, female ancestors as well, because it's super important to be as inclusive of people of all genders as possible. And the traditional text, of course, only refers to men. And so that is really a key piece of this. We're bringing in the merits of our ancestors. We're bringing in our hopes for blessing. It's a much more extensive prayer than is the Larry prayer, we could say, for Pesach, which is known as Kal, or dew. And that prayer is again noting the seasonal shift in the land from the rainy to the dry season. We are now noting the seasonal shift from the dry season to the rainy season. And it's a real hope for a good year. It's also, I think, an opportunity, and we talked a little bit about this in the description of the class today. Shemini Atzeret is a really good opportunity for us to be thinking about our relationship with the natural world. That we have often so sort of taken ourselves out of that. And Shemini Atzeret is a way of like actually being like, oh yeah, ultimately everything we are and have is rooted in our relationship with the natural world and with the cycles of the natural world. And so we might actually choose to take a little bit of time this year to just think about that. And wherever we are in the world, just think about how our well-being is intricately connected. I think that's ultimately what this prayer is about, the prayer for rain. Our well-being as human beings on this planet is intricately connected with the well-being of the planet, and we forget this much at our own peril. And so that's a really important opportunity for us to sort of fall back into that. I also want to, in a moment, we'll share screen again, and then I'll open it up for some comments. I wanted to say a couple of words about Shemini Atzeret as this day of pausing and reflection. As we said in the beginning, Atzeret can be understood either as an assembly day, so we're all coming together, quite literally, in the synagogue or wherever. It's a day where you don't go to work. It's the end of the festival, or it's its own festival. It's kind of both and. Liturgically speaking, we now consider it a separate festival, but there is this ambiguity. There's also this stopping. We've been on a bit of a marathon in terms of the month of Tishrei. Excuse me. We go from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, and 4 days later into Sukkot, and now we're in the middle of Sukkot. And as Shemini Atzeret is entering, the final day of Sukkot, known as Hoshana Rabbah, is ending. And in lots of communities, Hoshana Rabbah is this very unique day where there are 7 hakafot, 7 circles with the lulav and etrog. There are additional prayers said, and there's this incredible ritual known as the beating of the willows, where there are communities where people will literally take bundles of willows and just whack them over and over and over again on the ground, either inside the shul or outside. If it's inside, there's so many leaves to clean up later. But the goal here is this notion of Hoshana Rabbah is ending that season of repentance. The gates are still open, and we're just hoping that we've done all the tshuva, we've done good action, we've done all this work on ourselves. Please, 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 may we have a good year. And so Shmini Atzeret is coming off of that intensity. And so there's a certain way in which being able to quiet down after all of that intensity is a really beautiful opportunity. And I have heard many people over the years say, to other people, I've heard it in Shul and Shmini Atzeret, we're here for a holiday, we don't know why, and I often want to invite people to say, well, yes, it's been a marathon of a month, no question about that. I'm as tired as everyone else. And what an opportunity for us to just come to shul, just be together, have lovely meals, have a little bit of a break, a little bit of a pause. And I'm going to move in a moment to talking a little bit about how Simchat Torah enters the fray. Before we do that, I want to look briefly at a source from Talmud, and I want to then open it up to some comments. So what I'm going to invite us to do now is share screen again. I'm going to sort of summarize this text. We're not going to read it directly. Then I will open it up to any comments that may be arising, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about Simchat Torah and how it relates, and then we'll really focus back in on Shmini Atzeret. So the rabbis, as I've said a couple of times now, the rabbis are sort of this ambiguous place when it comes to Shmini Atzeret. Because Shmini Atzeret is a Torah mandated holiday. We've seen examples of that. There are also 2 cases of it being mentioned in different parts of Tanakh, once in the writings and once in the prophets. But again, in both of those cases, there's not a ton of detail. And one thing I did forget to mention that I wanted to mention, in those communities that do 2 days of Shmini Atzeret, the Torah reading for Shmini Atzeret, the first day, the day that is actually Shmini Atzeret, comes from Deuteronomy, which lists a calendar of the pilgrimage festivals. And interestingly, there, Shmini Atzeret is not mentioned. So I don't know why that is, but it's mentioned. It's not mentioned there. And what's interesting in Deuteronomy is that Shmini Atzeret, because it's not mentioned, there's a way in which biblical scholars have said Shmini Atzeret is only mentioned in those parts of Torah that are known as the priestly source or the P source. So a lot of Leviticus and a lot of Numbers, which came from, presumably, written by Kohanim, but written by priests. So this piece of Talmud, I gave you a Mishnah, and there's a little bit of Gemara before that Mishnah. In the Tractate of Sukkah, which of course is appropriate for this week, the rabbis are trying to figure out what makes Shmini Atzeret different. I almost want to use a totally seasonally inappropriate question. What makes the night of Shmini Atzeret different from all the other nights of the festival? or is it its own thing? And the rabbis are trying to figure that out. Like, what makes this different? So they go into lots of technical detail, which if you're super interested in that thing, in that, I encourage you to look at this on your own time. We're not going to go into the nitty-gritty of all the technical detail, but suffice it to say that, as I've said a couple times now, they are trying to figure out, okay, is this an actual day in its own right, a regel lifnei atzmo, it's a festival of its own, with its own observances, or is it somehow connected to Sukkot? And the answer is yes. The answer to that is yes. It is very much its own festival, a regel lifnei atzmo. In some communities, people don't eat in the sukkah anymore because the sukkah is only required for 7 days. In other communities, they do eat in the sukkah on the eighth day because there's ambiguity. Is the eighth day really the eighth day or the seventh day? That's a whole other calendrical question about why some diaspora communities keep 2 days. And it's becoming an interesting question as, of course, we are firmer and firmer on the calendar. And, that's a whole separate thing, but it was very live for the Babylonians, which are many of the rabbis who compiled the Gemara. And that's why also, as is true on any festival, you say what's called the Shechecheyanu blessing, which many of us know as this joyous blessing we say upon reaching joyful occasions. And because Shemini Atzeret is seen as its own joyful occasion, it gets its own blessing. And so it's a really interesting question of how we relate to Shemini Atzeret. And I'm going to pause there for a moment and just turn it back over to Rabbi Streifer and see if there are any questions either in the chat or vocally. If there are any people who want to unmute, I will be happy to take multiple questions at once if there are.
Sure. So, are there any questions? If people have questions, you can raise your hand electronically and I'll call on you. I have a question. First of all, I just dropped in the chat that Shemini Atzeret, and for those who don't know, Shemini Atzeret is next Tuesday. It's, coming up this week, which is why we're doing this today. It's also Wednesday on the traditional calendar. My question, Rabbi Tuchman, is I noticed that the word Atzeret in the Torah text it is called an Atzeret, right? This day is an Atzeret. Is the word Atzeret used to refer to other holidays, or is it specific to this one?
Thank you so much. I knew there was something else I wanted to mention. Thank you. I believe that Shavuot is sometimes called an Atzeret. I don't know if it is called that directly in the Torah, but my understanding is that at least rabbis, Shavuot is thought of as an Atzeret, meaning that Shavuot in some ways closes out the Pesach season and the Sirat HaOmer season. And so we have these two parallel holiday seasons, actually, one in the spring from Pesach through Shavuot, and one in the fall from Rosh Hashanah through Shemini Atzeret. And both of them have that Atzeret.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions people have? I don't see any other questions in the chat. Somebody posted some blog posts of Geshem poems that have not just male figures in them. That's interesting.
Oh, fantastic. Amazing. So I'll say a couple of words about Simchat Torah, and we'll look at a text from Talmud. So, because, as I mentioned, in many diaspora communities, especially when the Talmud was being compiled, the custom of this 2 day observance that some folks have really is a Babylonian custom. And one of the explanations for it is that there's a doubt around a calendar, um, because when the calendar was determined by witnesses, there was a real concern that people would not get to the various dispersions, the various places in which Jews lived outside of the land in time. It was really a practical question. So if people didn't get to, the community in Bavel in time, well, they might observe the holiday on the wrong day, and that has its own implications. So to make sure that that was not happening, they instituted this 2 day observance for all the pilgrimage festivals. And as aforementioned, this question arose, well, what do we do on this ninth day, like this day after, Shemini Atzeret, we've had this eighth day, we've got this additional day. What are we going to do with it? So as the Torah began to be read on an annual cycle, that's when Simchat Torah really came into being, and it grew in terms of custom and of honoring Torah and celebrating Torah and finding a way to end one year's cycle and begin another. And there's a lot of real beauty in that. There is a very long Baraita. I'll invite us to screen share. Again, there's a very long Baraita in Megillah 31a, which I did not bring you all of. If you are interested in Torah reading calendars, I encourage you to look at it. They talk about V'zot HaBracha, which is the final parsha of the Torah read on Simchat Torah, whether you do that coinciding with Shemini Atzeret or whether you do that on its own. And they mention that it's read on the second day of Shemini Atzeret, but they don't call it Simchat Torah. And the term Simchat Torah shows up in the 9th century in a Siddur um, by um, by Siddur Sadia Gaon Siddur in the 9th century. So that also is where we get that name, and then it kind of grew in custom and in joy. And now in many communities, whether it's with Simchat Torah or on its own, or excuse me, whether it's with Shemini Atzeret or on its own, Simchat Torah features the ending of the Torah reading and the beginning of the Torah reading in one swoop, because we never stop reading Torah. There's also this really beautiful idea that the last letter of the Torah is Lamed, and the first letter of the Torah is Bet, meaning Lev or Lev, heart. So the Torah is at the heart of who we are, and we never stop reading it. And as soon as we finished one cycle, we take a moment to get ourselves ready to start right back over again with Bereshit. And so I think because my feeling is that because Shemini Atzeret is fairly sparse in terms of its observance, people sort of needed something to distinguish, this day from everything else, and that's how Simchat Torah really grew and grew. I also think that there's something really beautiful about bringing in the joy of Torah as a way of ending this cycle. And I wanted to just also say a couple of words about my own experience of Shemini Atzeret, why I find it to be one of the most beautiful days of the fall holiday cycle, and why I'm so grateful to be able to share that with you today. So I think that ultimately, Shemini Atzeret is this culmination. There's a book that's become pretty classic in many of the circles that I find myself in. I imagine many of you have heard about it. It's called This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared by Rabbi Alan Lew of blessed memory. And it's this journey really from Tisha B'Av through Sukkot. He doesn't talk there about Shemini Atzeret so much, but this is a book that really talks about this spiritual and psychological journey from destruction to joy. And we've gone from the walls falling down on Tisha B'Av. We do this work in Elul around Tshuva and returning. We get to Rosh Hashanah where the gates open. The rabbis use, of course, the metaphor. We should, hasten to say that we talk about these metaphors of gates or of books. These are rabbinic metaphors of understanding the process that we're in. We're not talking about literal gates that literally open and close, or an actual book of life that we are actually inscribing ourselves in, but it's really about a metaphor for yearning, just deep, deep yearning for the year to come. And it's ultimately, I think, in lots of ways, both a joyous time and also a deeply liminal time, as Rabbi Streifer mentioned in the beginning of today's class, right? Like it's a very liminal time where we actually, and I think the tradition invites us into this, we don't know actually what the year's going to bring. And there's no guarantee, which is both really terrifying and really comforting in a certain way to be like, we're coming together at this time. We don't know what's coming. And I think that Shemini Atzeret, with its opportunity for pause and reflection, can actually give us a little bit of an opportunity to take in the holiday season. I certainly experience for myself, on Shemini Atzeret, often in the afternoon, I will pause and just kind of do a review of the month. Like, how is my Rosh Hashanah? How is my Yom Kippur? Because sometimes we're going so quickly through these sacred days that it's almost like the work of preparation and the work of renewal and the work of really being present gets subsumed by all of the doing and all of the going from one to the next to the next to the next. But Shmini Atzeret is about being. I think Yom Kippur is as well, but especially Shmini Atzeret, very much about being. We're not taking the lulav anymore. We're still saying Hallel, which is a passage of joyful singing, and it's a passage of Psalms that is said during this time. And we're still, engaged in joyous celebration, but it's less frenetic. It's less chaotic in lots of ways. It's just about being with people, resting in the ending of the season, taking a little bit of time to just go back over it all, noticing, like, oh, yeah, how was it this year? And how do we take this spiritually elevated time with us? I think that's the key thing, is bridging the gap between the sacred season that we're in and the rest of the year. And noticing the impulse I certainly have, and I'm sure many of us do, it's like, okay, I'm almost done the holidays. This thought's occurred to me, more than once over the last couple of weeks. Okay, we're almost getting there. Now we're in the middle of Sukkot. We just got to get through Shemini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, and we're done. It's like, that's not a helpful frame, because it's coming from exhaustion, right? I often explain, when folks who are not part of the Jewish world ask about this time, I often try to explain to them it would be as if Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas were smushed into 3 weeks. And so by the end of it all, it's like we're tired, we're ready just for a normal week and like, getting back to the grind. But I think Shmini Atzeret can kind of give us that stopping, that opportunity to just take it in a little bit, just to rest in it all. And as um, someone who's really, as Rabbi Streifer mentioned, we were really blessed to be able to sit a mindfulness retreat earlier this summer. As someone for whom that's a core part of my practice, I'm very committed to Jewish contemplative practice. I think that this day actually is an invitation. We are often really acculturated, excuse me, to keep moving. Go, 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 all kinds of reasons for that. And if we think about the ways in which Simchat Torah is very extroverted, it's very, I don't want to say over the top in a negative way, but like a very joyful, very outward, very, you know, strong, like joyous, celebratory day. Shmini Atzeret is this quiet, unassuming moment to just be. And that's what I love so much about it, is just an opportunity to stop, to literally just stop, to not do our work, to be together, and to just reflect. So I'm gonna pause there and turn it back over to Rabbi Streicher if there are any questions or conversations that folks want to have for a bit.
Absolutely. So I'll just point out a comment that I made in the chat, which is I said that it's like the Havdalah of the High Holy Days, that it helps bring
Yeah,
this time to an end.
I love that. It really is. It really is like a Havdalah of the high holidays. Absolutely.
Hmm. Are there other thoughts? I don't see much in the chat, and there's actually some stuff in the chat, but not exactly conversation about this. So I'm curious if people have comments, thoughts they'd like to share. I see Sydney's hand. Go ahead, Sydney.
Thank you. So, your comment, Rabbi, about the Havdalah it brought to mind the idea of with the Havdalah spices, which are so present in the olfactory sense for people who do have that sense. And the olfactory, the nose-based sensation or scent, that is such a quote unquote primal and very ancient sense, and it's so present and so much in the moment because it affects at least for me, it affects so much of my being. And the idea of what I was hearing about being present and just taking the time for Shemini Atzeret to just be in the moment and be in a more mindful, more conscious state that seems it seems connected in that way to Hadala with this smelling of the spices and how that also can bring one's consciousness and one's sense of being in the moment very strikingly, and how I connect that together, I guess.
I love that, Sydney. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. I love the way that you invite us really into thinking about the olfactory sense for those of us who have that available as this opportunity for real presence and real mindfulness and just, kind of conjuring in my own sense perception, like how beautiful the spices smell, right? And just thinking about cloves and thinking about any other spices that you use, just the way in which inhaling that, right, is part of Havdalah, it does kind of lift the neshama. That's part of why we do it, actually, right? Because it's this notion of bringing that sweetness of Shabbat into the rest of the week. There's a little bit of a bittersweetness, right? Because Shabbat is ending and the new week is beginning. Excuse me. And simultaneously, there's this, oh, but we want that spice. We want that bit of, excuse me, presencing to carry us into the rest of the week. And so that's why we bring in the spaces. And I think that that actually really fits with the theme of Shmini Atzeret, because Shmini Atzeret is that bittersweet goodbye. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for your teaching.
Other comments, questions, thoughts? Rabbi Tuchman and Sydney, the comment that Sydney just made me think about the way that holidays are so heightened, but that there is sort of like a piece of them that we want to bring into the week. Just like Shabbat is this heightened thing that then we want to bring a piece of it into the week. So we need a kind of a transitional ritual to help us to distill the holiday or distill Shabbat or distill whatever is that heightened moment for the ordinary, because we can't live every day in the heightened. I'm in the chat here and it says, oh, Mel's says she's thinking about adding cloves to the etrog, which is a beautiful way to make a spice box. And Bob has his hand up. Go ahead, Bob.
Rabbi, you had mentioned something about the similar harvest or holidays of Shavuot and Sukkot, the end of Sukkot, and Shemini Atzeret. And these are the times when the prayer for water changes from rain to dew and dew to rain. Is there more to that than just a standard, agricultural cycle?
It's a really beautiful question. Thank you for that. I will say a couple of things about it. It's particularly pronounced nowadays, it's really confined to the liturgy. I think that when we were far more agriculturally rooted, and I do want to name that around the Jewish world, both in the land of Israel and in the diaspora, there are Jewish farmers who are really interested actually in reclaiming wherever they are Jewish agricultural practice. So I know that that is true across North America. And I know that's true in lots of other places as well, that there are lots of Jews that are interested in that. And so that's just a sidebar, but definitely if that's something folks are interested in learning more about, it's really interesting stuff. In terms of the agricultural cycle, I think it really fundamentally is about what we were talking about earlier about that yearning for a good crop and recognizing the seasonal shift in the land of Israel, where the liturgy is centered, right, in lots of ways. And so that's why, for example, with Shemini Atzeret, I mentioned the prayer for rain. But in addition to that, many people have the custom in their prayers from Shmini Atzeret through Pesach of adding the line in the second paragraph of the Amidah. So apologies, I'm getting a little technical, but in the paragraph that I think people often refer to as gevurot, right? Is that a correct way to think about that second paragraph? There's a line that gets added, Mashiv Habruach Umarid Hagashem, the one who causes the wind to blow and the rain to fall. That said after the prayer for rain. And it's this interesting experience of I notice in my community, sometimes people will say that a little louder, the first time, Mashiv Haruach or Marita Gashem. And it's this, not only it's agricultural, but it's also just this reminder of like, oh yeah, now the year is moving into this other season. I don't know that it is more than an agricultural thing, but I think it is deeply rooted in the agricultural cycle. And it's very much connected to prayer being not only for ourselves, but also for the world and also for the earth. I think that that's a really important piece that has unfortunately been left out of a lot of our practice that I think we could find a lot of ways to come back into.
Thank you. Um, are there other comments or questions or thoughts for Rabbi Tuchman? Rabbi Tuchman, I'll just throw one out there, which maybe you're going to address
Yeah.
anyway. But I'm curious if you have practices, recommended practices for Shmini Atzeret to help us, especially those of us that may not be going to shul, that may not be saying the prayer for Geshem. How could we mark this day? That's the question I had. And if does anyone else have
Yeah.
anything else they'd like to throw out there?
No, I love that. A couple of things I would really invite folks to do, however you are observing. And thank you for that question, because I noticed I spent a lot of time on the liturgy and I wanted to spend some time on the practical. So happy to move into that section. Um, Whatever your practices are, whether you're going to be at shul or not, just take a little bit of time to just think about your year. Just pause and be like, we're at the end of this season. We're about to move into the rest of the year. How has it been? What are some things that went really well? Just inventory. It can be written, it can be in your own reflection. It can be if you're a meditator, you might use it as a meditation practice. Just to think about like how your year has gone and to think about maybe you take a little time to take a walk, notice the nature around you, pay attention to just kind of the changing wherever you are. I imagine most of us are in North America, like the changing climate. Um, and I would also just invite some kind of reflection on the importance of the well-being of the earth, which ultimately is what the prayer for rain is about. And are there poems that are really important? Or I'm sure Jill Hammer has written something amazing about this, or Shamira Chandler. Also, there are lots of really interesting earth-based Jewish practice places now. There are lots of people thinking about these things. So that's something to kind of bear in mind is like maybe there's a poem, or maybe you could do your own journaling, or just taking even a few minutes to just be deeply present with where you are and with the moment as it is. I think that's ultimately what Shmini Atzeret is about. It's this notion of lingering in the spiritual elevation of the high holidays. We can do that wherever we are. And I actually will even go as far as to say that I think that one of the challenges of this time is that sometimes when you're in a synagogue context, in my experience, sometimes you can actually be a little bit taken out of the wider reflection because you're so focused on the prayer book or you're so focused on this, that, and the other thing. And so sometimes it can be really helpful to actually be like, I'm going to just take a little time to be with where exactly I am and exactly what I'm doing in this moment. So, yeah, I really want to invite us to just take some time for personal contemplation, whatever that is for you.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer, and I appreciate that. You're making me want to go for a walk in the forest next Tuesday.
Please, that's a great way. I love that. I love that.
Are there, in the few minutes we have left, are there any more questions? Either questions for Rabbi Tuchman or just comments, things that this discussion has been bringing up for you?
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
So I don't see any others. So Rabbi Tuchman, if you want to, do you have any closing thoughts, and then I'll close us out.
Yeah, and then we can always pause in the spirit of Shemini Atzeret and give folks a moment too. Yeah, I just I really believe that, I think about this a lot with the high holiday season in general, that sometimes we are so
I'm going upstairs to make the bed.
focused on,
Oh,
we're so focused on the words in the Siddur, the Machzor. We're so focused on whatever is like, there's so much activity. And I think that there really is a place for slowing down. And I think there really is a place for just taking it all in. This calendar is a marathon. And I really think also that Shemini Atzeret gives us an opportunity not only for our own inner reflection, as has been true in lots of other parts of the holiday season, but also if you have the opportunity to even just like invite a friend over and have a leisurely conversation with them, or go get coffee or whatever it is that you do, and just spend that time just being with each other. I think we're in a world now where we are so mediated by algorithmic social media that we are forgetting how to relate to one another. And even though this is not directly in the Torah about Shmini Atzeret, I actually think that part of the lingering nature of the holiday is another opportunity to just be with your people in a very real way, not just through an algorithmic social media feed, but actually really deeply in connection. So if there's one thing that I want to invite us into the Shmini Atzeret, just to take a little bit of time. And if it's okay, I also just want to note that Shmini Atzeret is the yard site of my grandmother. And so I just want to dedicate our learning in her memory as well. And she would not have known what Shmini Atzeret is, but I always kind of get a kick out of the fact that that's her yard site. And I should mention actually that Shmini Atzeret is one of the 4 times a year. I completely neglected to mention this at the top. I apologize. This is one of the 4 holidays a year, the others being Yom Kippur, Pesach, and Shavuot, when the Yizkor, or the memorial prayer, is recited. So it's another opportunity to be in community and to just honor our loved ones and honor our community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rabbi Tuchman. And Rabbi, there's Sydney said in the chat, may her memory be for a blessing of your
Oh,
grandmother.
thank you.
And several people have said this was a beautiful teaching. Let me close us out by, first of all, thanking Rabbi Tuchman. You have completely transformed Shemini Atzeret for me. I can't say I ever really thought about Shemini Atzeret very much. And now I'm thinking about it really differently. And I'm really looking forward to some kind of practice next Tuesday to close out this this intensive holiday season. So I'm grateful to you for that. I'm grateful to everybody for being here and participating in this conversation. I just want to mention, first of all, that if you are interested in further information or learning with Rabbi Tuchman, she has a website, which I'll drop in the chat. And you can also, if you're wanting to do some Jewish mindfulness, this is just because I'm thinking about this. There's an organization which is how Rabbi Tuchman and I met, which is called Neshev. They're based here in Toronto, and they do Jewish mindfulness online. You can join once or twice a week if you really just need some stillness in your life. If you're looking for more text learning, more ongoing text learning, you want to set aside an hour a week or an hour a month for Jewish learning and Jewish connection, talk to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I would love to talk to you more about how you can do that through La'asok. And finally, I'll just wish everybody a Chag Sameach. May it be a joyous and hopeful and meaningful Sukkot holiday leading up next week to Shemini Atzeret as we take one last deep breath, ending this holiday season and beginning 5786. Thanks again, Rabbi Tuchman, and thanks everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been truly a delight. Chag Sameach.